Hey everybody, Cybertao here. Wanted to do one last sort of peek into what my expectations were for the Carlsen-Nepomniachtchi match. They have a long track record playing together. They basically came up together in the same junior tournaments. At a certain point, Nepomniachtchi was actually seen as more promising than Carlsen, but then Carlsen very quickly surpassed him. But they have a long track record, and going into the match, Nepomniachtchi actually had a plus life score against Carlsen. Some of the games were when they were 12 or 13, so some of them you could potentially disregard. But this game here, this was played in the 2011 Vaikonze tournament. This is one of the games that made me think that Nepomniachtchi had a real chance against Carlsen. That if Nepomniachtchi were able to consistently get positions like this on the board, he would have a chance to impose his style of play and force play along channels that would be favorable to him. Nepomniachtchi was black here, e4, c5. So, I mean, everything's wiser in hindsight, but I do not understand for the life of me why we didn't see more Sicilians in this match. Nepomniachtchi came out with a very solid repertoire. You could tell that he was very much trying to restrain himself and trying to restrain Carlsen's opportunities from the white pieces. And in a round-robin tournament, it's much easier to play a more aggressive and more risky opening because there's plenty of other games to come, and it's not a match situation where it's a zero-sum game where a loss is automatically a win for your opponents and vice versa. But I'm still very surprised that we didn't see Sicilian. Nepomniachtchi is known for having a dynamic, aggressive style and thriving in positions with tactical opportunities. I do not see why we didn't see more openings like this from Nepomniachtchi. So Carlsen played knight f3, d6, and the Najdorf. And this is, I would say, the soundest of all the super aggressive openings. The Najdorf is one of the openings that you can reliably play as black if you're looking for a fight and not worry about taking too many chances. It sort of keeps the draw in hand and keeps aggressive play on your side. So there are plenty of options here for white. Bishop e2. This is definitely one of the options that's within Carlsen's style. It's a very classical and solid style. White basically just continues with development and then figures things out later. Bishop g5. This would be, I would say, it would be fair to call this the main line still. It was basically considered the only move in the 50s and 60s. Other moves started to be added. Then, of course, Bobby Fischer is famous for his predilection for bishop c4. In fact, sometimes this is called the Fischer-Sozin. But bishop g5 is where most of the theoretical developments of the 50s and 60s took place. The main crazy line of the Najdorf, or one of the main crazy lines. This would be called the poison pawn variation. And here, I mean, theory for this goes out to move 30. This is well known for taking place in correspondence chess, and computer chess. It's difficult to play this over the board reliably. The main miracle of modern play for the Najdorf is h3. And this was made fun of back in the 60s for being played by one of Fischer's victims, a guy named Weaver Adams. But here, in modern play, this is really seen as one of the most flexible moves. It prepares g4 while leaving the rest of white's minor pieces completely flexible, and leaving the f-pawn completely flexible. So, instead of preparing g4 with f3, white can potentially hope to play f4 in one go in certain positions, which can be a game. I don't think it's better or worse, it's just more interesting. But bishop e2, very classical, very, very much in Carlsen's style. e5, this is the main way of playing the Najdorf. So the pawn comes to e5, controls these valuable d4 and f4 squares, shoos this aggressive knight on d4 away. The main alternative here is e6. This would be nearly an entirely different opening. This would be an opening called the Scheveningen. The spelling's there if you want to take a look at it. I'm pretty sure that's the correct way to say it, Scheveningen. It's actually a town in the Netherlands, if I remember right. But anyways. Black here plays a bit more solidly. He keeps pawn control of the d5 square. The downside is this a little bit more cramped for black. Obviously, he's not freeing his light square bishop like with this move. He's not controlling those squares actively like with this move. And it's a trade-off. In a lot of major modern openings, we see that a hole on d5, and this is a hole in black structure, this hole on d5, we see that that's a genuine trade-off and not just a positional demerit. Black is gaining things for this pawn hole in d5. He's gaining control of those key squares. He's gaining activity with his pieces. It's not just a one-sided positional defect. And we see that revolution and that way of thinking in a lot of other modern openings. You only have to think of the Sveshnikov. Same idea. So the pawn comes to e5, and suddenly black is taking on this, voluntarily taking on this pawn hole on d5, but he's gaining things for it. He's gaining control of those d4 and f4 squares. He's shooing away white's aggressive knight on d4. It's not just a one-sided positional defect. So e5, it's the main knight-orf way of playing. Knight b3, this is the main line approach. Knight f3 is another way, but it's just never been terribly popular. 7, castle, castle. King h1. So this is a very common Sicilian tuckaway. So it's preparing f4 by taking this king off this potentially vulnerable g1 to a7 diagonal. There are other ways of playing. Bishop e3 is the most popular way, but this comes with concrete drawbacks. The drawback here is that on f4, white has a choice. He can take an f4 with the rook. If he takes on f4 with the bishop, he's lost a whole tempo. It's sort of similar to the tempo that you can lose in the queen's gambit. The bishop comes to e3, and then it spends another whole move taking an f4. Or if white avoids that tempo loss. This rook in f4 is just really sort of awkward looking. It doesn't have a really profitable rook lift over to h4 or something. And at a certain point, this rook will most likely just retreat to another square. This is very comfortable for black. So king h1, white is still looking to play f4 at a certain point, but he's looking to not lose a tempo on taking back an f4 with the bishop. So he's playing this small improving move at king h1, and then playing f4 and hoping not to lose that tempo with his bishop. Now the downside is, this is just a king move, and it is an investment of time. So in a certain way, he's losing a tempo to try to gain a tempo, which is a genuine trade-off of sorts. But this, in a certain way, this looks like white's most promising, because king h1 is an improving move. It takes the king out of harm's way. Knight c6, f4. So now if black takes an f4, this isn't nearly as good for black, because white hasn't lost that time. King h1 is a genuine improving move. Queen e1, and this actually looks fairly decent for white. White has a couple of different ideas. He can play rook e1 and queen g3 to target that weak pawn on d6, or he can play queen g3 with the idea of just a direct kingside attack. This looks very comfortable. So b5 is the main line here. This is still all well within theory. Bishop b3, bishop b7. One idea in the Knight-Orf that black always has to be looking at is b4. And here it does win a pawn, but a lot of times this b4 push, unless properly prepared, is just incredibly weakening, and you don't want to play it too soon or else white's pieces just completely overrun the squares that are being given up. So here, white's just completely winning. Black can't actually take this pawn on e4. Simple move, bishop f3, and suddenly all these pieces in the long diagonal are going to be skewered off. If the knight comes back to here, we just win a piece. If f5, I mean, this is just such a rotten position for black. I mean, we could play queen d3. That looks quite good. This is just such a rotten position for black, and it's not even worth the pawn, because white's going to get that pawn back at will, more or less. So bishop b7, just a sound development move. The bishop goes to this natural diagonal, aims for this e-pawn through the long diagonal, covers that long diagonal, so that b4 is a genuine threat that white has to respond to. There's another way of playing this as black. Taking an e4 is, now that the bishop's come to e3, taking an f4 is perfectly fine. And then knight e5. The e5 square is now a permanent outpost for black pieces. It sort of balances out the outpost on d5. This position has been seen a few times, and this looks completely balanced. Bishop b7, it's more in Nepomniachtchi's style. It keeps more tension on the board. It doesn't release any of the central tension between those pawns. It just continues development. I like it. a4, looking to exploit that. Rook x e4. So this, it looks to avoid losing the tempo with bishop x f4. But it's also a little bit awkward. Bishop x f4 is a little bit more natural in certain ways, just losing the tempo. And here, we can show what happens if black decides to eat this pawn. This is still quite dangerous. And black isn't losing the pawn back immediately, but this is just such good compensation for white. The f5 was sort of forced, and it creates these horrible internal weaknesses. e6 is a horribly weak square. This whole a2 to g8 diagonal is horribly weak. All of white's pieces are quite well placed. White can just, let's say if black takes, white has just a very simple plan, bring the rooks to d1 and e1, and then just plow forward through the center. And again, there's so many weaknesses in black's position that he just can't expect to hold on to either material or position. But knight e5 is much more solid. a5, and this looks very balanced. This knight on e5 is incredibly strong. Of course, white can't actually take this, because then black just plays bishop f6, and we're getting the pawn back anyways, and then we have this incredibly nice bishop pair for our problems. So rook x f4 looks to avoid all of that. It sort of helps protect this tender e4 pawn, but this rook's also quite awkward on f4. It's vulnerable to eventual bishop g5 tricks at some point. So knight e5, the e5 square is a permanent outpost for black's pieces, so it's quite natural to immediately occupy that. Queen d4, it's important to look at this. Black actually gets a pawn back immediately. The rook is forced back. And this is very comfortable for black. Basically, we've traded white's e-pawn for our b-pawn. That's a gain for black. Especially now this bishop has an incredibly strong long diagonal. White's king is going to be a little bit drafty. So queen d4 looks to hold that central bastion in place. Knight c6, if black is looking to avoid a repetition, just taking an a5, completely viable way of doing it, but Nepomniachtchi decides to check in on Carlsen to see if he's happy with the draw. So if Carlsen were happy with the draw here, queen d4 would repeat the 3-time repetition they could sign. But this was a tournament, and Carlsen was looking to be ambitious. So he took him b5. And objectively, this is not the way to go, because this is unleashing the activity of black's pieces. And this rook and f4 is just going to end up being completely disconnected from the position. So take. Rook e1 was played. That's probably the best move here. If the rook takes an a8, this is a very favorable positional transformation for black. So material's still even, but again, we've traded the e-pawn for the b-pawn, which is a big gain for black. Generally, whenever you can trade a flank pawn for a center pawn, that's a positional gain for you. In this particular position, this bishop on e4 just rules the board. It points to the c-pawn, it points towards this weak king side over here. Black's got this useful battery on the long diagonal with the queen backing up the bishop. This is a very nice position for black. So rook e1 just looks to keep everything solid. Knight g6, rook f1, b4. If the knight takes, this position's different, and this is still decent for black, but this position's different because black doesn't have this deadly battery in the long diagonal. Plus, white's a little bit better developed here. He's got his rooks on e1 and f1, which is useful development to have. b4 looks to play a little bit more aggressively. Knight e4. And this is the difference that Nepomniachtchi was most likely looking for. It's the move that he would have seen when he played b4. Black is coordinating very nicely to start pressure up against white's king side. So this bishop on b7 is still incredibly strong, but now it's coordinating with other pieces that generate pressure on the long diagonal. This knight on h4 is suddenly aiming at this weak point on g2. In fact, there's some tactical scenarios where we could just immediately take on g2 and play knight d2 with a discover check. So white has to be incredibly careful here. So bishop f3 is weakening, but it's understandably looking to cover up the long diagonal immediately. White could also play knight d4, but it's still, weakness is eventually forced. And black has a humongous edge here. This is opposite colored bishops, equal material for now, but just the state of white's king side. This incredibly weak pawn on f3, the strong bishop on b7. When you contrast these two bishops, it's a humongous gain for black. This is a very nice position for black. And here, the opposite colored bishops don't generate drawing chances. Drawing chances with opposite colored bishops you really only see in a pure endgame. In a complicated middle game like this, with queens on the board, opposite colored bishops almost always favor the attacking player, because white doesn't have a piece that can cover the light squares. So here, this is a very favorable position. So bishop f3 looks to cover the long diagonal. G takes, if rook takes. Black is still much better here. White hasn't managed to barricade the long diagonal. Both these minor pieces are incredibly strong, especially compared to their white counterparts. Gx f3, it weakens the king side, but it looks to permanently barricade the long diagonal somehow. Queen d7, and this is probably the miscalculation that Carlsen made, because in this position, if you're just sort of idly looking at the position, you might think that black is forced to retreat that knight. If black retreats the knight, suddenly the tables are turned, and white's completely winning here. But queen d7, it's the only move here, but it's sufficient for black to be nearly winning here. That knight on e4 can't be touched. Rook a4 is a very nice move to bring that piece into the game. And black is simply mating here. This game is over. So bishop f4 is nearly forced, but rook a4 all the same. And again, it's quite clever how Nepomniachtchi is using that geometry to lift the rook over to help with the kingside attack. Knight f6, so suddenly this rook on a4 is hitting the bishop on f4. Queen g4, not the most accurate. It doesn't spoil everything. Queen h3 looks more accurate. e3, rook takes. And this is part of a class of positions that are going to be very common from all these variations. Black has a near decisive advantage here. White's king is just way too exposed. Material's even. And generally, bishop versus knight is an advantage for the side that has the bishop. But here, the difference is white's king is so exposed compared to the black counterpart that black is always going to be generating threats and pushing white back just because he constantly has to keep an eye on this incredibly weak king. So queen g4 doesn't spoil everything. It's not the best move, though. So knight d4. Queen c8. Queen f5 is a little bit more accurate. Queen c8 starts to drift a bit too much. But queen f2 is incredibly passive. If there's one thing that I tell my students over and over, it's do not defend passively. Defend actively. Try to create counter threats. Try to create counter chances for your opponent to respond to, rather than just passively sitting back and waiting for things to happen. If you don't have any counter chances, your opponent can just build at leisure, and that's when you get into these horrible passive positions. Bishop g5 is better, just trying to create threats, kick this knight away. Bishop d2, and this is still practically difficult for white. I think over the board this would still be much easier for black to play, just because the white king is so exposed. But white has genuine counter chances here. You know, the bishop can come to c3. It'll be very useful on the long diagonal. This is probably balanced, but queen f2 is just way too passive. Knight e4, and now this knight on e4 is just going to be incredibly strong. It's going to be backed up by f5, and then you can easily envision black's kingside pawns getting moving eventually. Rook e8, mobilizing the rook. h6, just a useful timeout move. It takes away a lot of tactical opportunities for whites based on the back rank. Also prepares an eventual g5, getting the kingside pawns moving. Rook e6, thinking about a rook lift over to g6, which would be deadly. King h2, c4, probably best to mobilize these pawns while I can. b4, this is near the decisive error. Queen c4 immediately looks to take advantage of this pin on the a2 to g8 diagonal and slow black down. Black is still better here. I mean, these pawns are much faster than the queenside counterparts. But this pressure on the a2 to g8 diagonal is holding black up quite nicely. b4 doesn't create any of that counterplay. King h7, so now there's not going to be a pin on the a2 to g8 diagonal, and black's just free to bum rush on the king side. Rook g6, so creating deadly threats on the g2 square. Queen b5, just concretely generating threats, so hitting the rook on e2. Rook c6, just continuing to generate threats, and now the rook is threatened to take on c2. Queen a6 was a little bit more accurate, but I think rook c6 is the more practical move. And rook xc4, and this is why maybe queen a6 was maybe a little bit more accurate, because practically this allows white some chance at salvation. I think objectively this is dead loss, but I think practically it might be hard to win this over the board for white. But Nepomniachtchi does a good job of converting. h5, so we don't want to allow h5 from white, obviously. c4, so this is the final mistake of the game. Queen f3 was mandatory here, aiming at this newly found weakness on h5. And this position is winning, but it's going to be difficult for black to convert this. This is a position where white can put up quite a bit of resistance. Long term, it should be winning for black. I think objectively, it should be winning by force. But c4 doesn't aim at any of those weaknesses. And now suddenly, black is generating threats both against the g3 bishop here and against these queenside pawns. This is just lost. And now, there's no rogue b pawn for whites, so these positions are much easier to convert. Queen f3, notice on queen f5, queen c4 was a very tidy move, or queen xc4. Here, this queen just happens to be controlling all of the checks. There's no check on c8, there's no check on this diagonal here. And we'll show the rest of the game for completionist's sake. But Nepomniachtchi does a solid job of converting this. This isn't a difficult task for someone of his strength. Black is just moving his pieces forward solidly. He's playing rook f1 at a time where he knows there's no annoying checks to pick up this rook. So then bring the rook back to the d file to threaten penetration. And then we trade down at the right time. Sometimes these classes of positions can be draws, but here it's not. And rook d7 is a very nice move. The bishop is forced off this diagonal, so if it comes to h4, just king g4. Otherwise, on a move like there, simplest is just king g5, and we win this h-pawn here. So, very nice game from Nepomniachtchi. He utilized his initiative that he gained from the opening quite nicely. I think this is the key moments. Basically, the first part of this game was all theory. This has mostly just been seen before, and this is a somewhat well-known knight-orth position. And this is a position where white doesn't really have much better than taking the repetition. But once white avoids the repetition, Nepomniachtchi did an amazing job of just developing his initiative. Just consistently driving white's pieces back and gaining counterplay. This knight h4 maneuver was a fantastic move. Again, it goes against those schoolyard catechisms that we all know so well. But here, it's the perfect square for the knight, because sometimes it threatens to drop back to f5 and maybe come to g3, but mostly it's generating pressure on the long diagonal with this bishop on b7. This is a fantastic move. And it forced Carlsen to generate these weaknesses on the king side. And from then on, there were a couple of micro inaccuracies from black, but in general, I mean, this is a very nice conversion from Nepomniachtchi. He just very diligently fought for the initiative and converted it very well. Like I said, this game more than any other made me think Nepomniachtchi had genuine chance against Carlsen. If Nepomniachtchi had played like this, with black pieces in every game, this would have been an entirely different match. Entirely different match. I do not, for the life of me, I don't understand why we saw the Petrov. Don't be afraid to play to your strengths. If your strengths are aggressive, attacking chess, don't pretend to be something you're not. Good life lesson is good, as well as a good chess lesson. Be who you are and maximize who you are in your best moments. Nepomniachtchi is a genius at dynamic and initiative-based chess. We should have seen that. We shouldn't have seen attempts from him to play these Carlsen-style positions. So, very sad missed opportunity from Nepomniachtchi. I'm going to do a quick review of the match in my next bits, and then we're going to move on to a series that we were doing about Mikhail Tal before the match began. I'll see you then.